Yes, we can have a go.
Okay, so hello everyone, and we are so much delighted to have Professor Alexandria Innes with us today. Professor Innes has joined the Violence and Society Center at City University of London since 2020, and she is working as a senior lecturer in international politics at that university. She has worked on multiple concepts linked to migration, mainly citizenship, security, ontological security, and the everyday. And through her work, she has published 2 monographs, Colonial Citizenship and Everyday Transnationalism in 2019, and before it, Migration, Citizenship, and the Challenge for Security in 2015, in addition to multiple articles in academic journals. So, Professor Innes, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for being here with us today. We are all looking forward to your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be able to share some of my research with you. This is a really, really nice opportunity, and yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to talk about the relationship between everyday violence and ontological security. I'll talk a little bit about approaches to the everyday first, and sort of where this sits for me at the moment in the context of international relations. And then I'll do that before I get into ontological security studies, but I'll then sort of give an example of how I've applied research on everyday violence to ontological security using a particular case. And the case is maybe a bit specific to the UK, although I think that it maybe can be applied in other contexts as well. So I'm just gonna flip through, if I can, advance the slides. This is just a funding slide that I have to put on my presentations to thank the funders. And so my research background has been to look at experiential international relations. I've been interested firstly in migration journeys, and then in particular experiences of international relations through the lens of intersectional identities and their relationship with the systems and structures of power, in particular in the context of migration and citizenship. So at the moment, I'm looking particularly at experiences of violence, but a question that keeps cropping up for me and has done for the last few years now is how to access the everyday and what are the best ways and means of doing so. And so in the past, I've done ethnographic research and narrative interviews and focus groups. But more recently, I've been reflecting a little bit, sort of driven by past projects and a couple of experiences. I've been reflecting a little bit on the ethics of experiential research, I suppose. And I have 2 sort of key concerns or like points that I'm still grappling with a little bit. And these are with regard to trauma-informed research and also with regard to properly communicating expertise by experience. So on the first one, with regard to trauma-informed research, obviously this comes up quite a bit when researching migration or people's experiences of immigration systems and processes. And I think asking people to recount past or sometimes even current traumatic events has to be approached with great care and, you know, best practice with professional support. And I think practicing a rule of asking questions of people only where necessary and to uncover new information that's not accessible elsewhere already is a good starting point. But I think all research that's dealing with violence and trauma needs to be trauma-informed and approached with caution. We should be thinking, I think, of the value of the research for the participant. So, you know, I think we do need to know about everyday experiences for international relations in general, but we need to also be constantly reflecting on how international relations is of use to the participants. And especially research in migration and violence, we're often thinking about experiences of people during really the most difficult times or some of the most difficult times of their lives. Immigration systems and structures strip people of their agency and actively make them vulnerable, either by removing the protection of the law, by directly threatening their physical presence in a particular territory, or by removing their access to political participation or any form of political or legal accountability. So asking people to reflect on and recount these things can be potentially traumatizing in itself or re-traumatizing. And so I think academic training in the context of carrying this out is often very limited. And additionally, in research design, we can make these very strong theoretical cases for the need for this sort of experiential data. But also, I think we need to have that deeper level of looking at where the theoretical cases are enough to justify the way that, you know, we might go about this. And I'm thinking of my own research in particular and kind of how I've approached this in the past. If you want to, on the one hand, prioritize sort of unmediated experiences, then you might say the fewer steps between the participant and the output, the better. But on the other hand, if you want to practice care for the participants, then accessing data that already exists might sometimes be the best way to go about it. So I'm not sort of saying we should never do interviews and ethnographies, but that we should always be considering this relationship between extracting information and then what that information can do or is intended to do for the owners of the experiences when designing research methods. So this is sort of what I'm navigating in the context of trying to research everyday violence. The second point on the everyday that I raised was that the question of how to properly communicate expertise by experience. So I think we should always think about how we're portraying participants within research in a way that can reproduce voices faithfully and is done properly in a context to recognize the credibility of those voices and can communicate the value of expertise by experience in an academic setting. So this reflection comes from my most recent book, which is a few years old now, where I recounted the immigration story of my granddad. So my method was life narrative. I did life narrative interviews, a lot of them over quite a long period of time. But I was so close to the data that I was constantly navigating positionality and the relationship with the narrative. So not just my relationship with it, but also how it was embedded within my whole family. And any story that my granddad told about his family life was co-owned by my grandma or my mom and my aunt and uncle, who also experienced this. And oftentimes they all told a version of the same story that they'd all experienced in different ways. So this gave me some interesting insight into positionality and relationships with stories and narratives of data, as using them as data. And when I put this book together, and this is sort of why it raised questions for me, when I put this book together, I showed the first draft to my granddad, and he pointed out that I, in his words, made him look stupid. And the reason for this was when I was trying to stay true to his voice, which was this sort of Cypriot accented fluent Geordie dialect, I'd written his vernacular embedded within my academic prose. And so we talk to each other in a very similar register, but the written communication actively demonstrated the gap between lived experience and academic writing. And we addressed this by shifting lengthy excerpts into their own sections in the book to precede the chapters, to clearly demarcate the difference between academic writing and first-hand vernacular as it was transcripted in the book. But it then made me think of all the previous interviews that I'd written up, where in my attempt to be true to the voice of the participants, I'd potentially undermined the credibility of their experience structured as expertise, or I might have inadvertently written something that participants might be uncomfortable with, or that portrayed them in a way that they weren't happy with. And so in the context of these reflections, I've been thinking a lot about sort of what we mean by the everyday and the best routes to accessing it in the context of international relations. And so that sort of leads me to the current project. So in this current project, I've been working with secondary data rather than first-hand experiential research, and I've been trying to attend to how we can understand the relationship between everyday violence and then the systems and structures of international relations, of the state, and of international migration and the regimes of international migration and immigration systems. In this piece of research, I consider what an ontological security approach can offer to our understanding of the security-immigration nexus, with particular attention to state violence against migrants and the intersectional inequalities that are reproduced by this operation of state violence. So migrants in insecure status are more likely to experience violence than the general population. And I've actually just published an article that quantifies this and measures prevalence of violence relatively recently. In part, this heightened experience of violence is due to constructed vulnerabilities along migration routes. It's in part due to state enforcement mechanisms, both at the border and internal to the state. The security immigration nexus has been very well established in academic literature, in critical security studies, but I think often attention specifically to violence tends to be absent. And this is true of international relations literature generally. There was a really nice analysis of this published a few years ago in International Studies Review, I think, but also of ontological security studies specifically. So ultimately, I suggest that the state weaponizes domestic violence as part of the arsenal of deterrence, which directly targets, or I look at ways in which it directly targets migrant women. And so in this project, to do this, I adopt the state's own framework for assessing state responsibility in the context of deaths as a result of domestic violence, in the context of fatal domestic violence, where the state looks at its own responsibility for missing opportunities for intervention. I underpin the study in ontological security studies, and I look at two of the existing narrative framings for ontological security. So I look at ontological security that's made endogenous to the state, making identity and offering insight into the sometimes counterintuitive security acts. So going back to relatively early research from Brent Steele and others, and then that which is exogenous to the state, looking at state action through the position of the state relative to its self-understanding in the international community, drawn on Aisha Zarakal and others as well. So I think my approach holds that limiting discussion to the state or understanding the state-society nexus as the driver of state action has the effect of reproducing extant inequality and making insecurity within society in order to present a cohesion outside of society, so that the endogenous and the exogenous are sort of connected in that way. I argue that ontological insecurity in the context of the literature in IR, because I know there's an ontological security literature in psychology and in sociology as well, so I'm drawn on work in international relations, is violent in its expression, and that this violence calcifies existing inequality and division. So I'll move to ontological security in a little bit more detail. I don't want to sort of rehearse the whole ontological security sub-paradigm and the plethora of interventions that it's made, especially I think over the last sort of 6 to 7 years, it's really grown as a sub-paradigm, and there's been a lot of really great research. And sometimes it feels quite difficult to kind of harness it all, I think. But my approach focuses on narrative and performative ontological security, and I look at these two dimensions that I introduced. So I look at ontological security exogenously derived, in which state identity and actions can be explained by exogenous forces that act upon state identity and shape the state's way of being in the world. But I sort of depart from the assumption that states can be agents with a sense of selfhood, and instead I look at this observable behavior as a way of continuously remaking state legitimacy. So the state can be defined as a system of power. And I will say that I'll continue to use the term the state shorthand, but what I conceptualize or try to conceptualize is the state as a system of power rather than a unitary actor. I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that when I talk about state violence in a little while. So rather than looking at the ontological security of one state that's produced or protected through state actions that respond to its relational position in the world, I instead consider how these actions serve to maintain and reinforce the notion that violence is legitimate when authorized by the state. That is the legitimate use of violence to reinforce the modern Western ideology of sovereignty, citizenship, and legal belonging. Legitimacy locates power and permits some actors and ideologies to retain power over others. As Zarakal argued, and I'm drawn on a 2017 article, the state both provides and seeks ontological security. The modern state is the primary ontological security provider, although this hasn't always been the case, but sovereignty derives from this role. And if challenge to the role arises, and I think for Zarakal it's in the form of institutionalized authority, then the state must seek ontological security to maintain its political authority over the monopoly on the use of violence. So I think the exogenous unit of the ontologically secure state can be identified through the uncontested acts of violence that the state is sanctioned to perform, and which intensify if that ontological security is under threat for a single state actor. So things like violent border enforcement and the conspicuous passive violence of allowing boats to flounder and preventing sea rescues, which we've seen all too often recently in the Mediterranean, would be an example of that. But I think if we sort of are limited to this state-centric approach, we risk homogenizing the population at multiple levels of abstraction, and it locates ontological security provision by states for people. So populations within states have to have shared defining characteristics through which ontological security is sought and reproduced on a societal level. So that leads to the second dimension. And that's the ontological security produced endogenously to the state and attached to identity making within the state. So here I turn to the insights of the Lacanian approach to anxiety, this constant lack of the solidified self that I think has been covered really well in the literature, especially I'm thinking of Mina Krikochoi's work, particularly requiring, so this constant lack of the solidified self requires the constant remaking of it, which can be seen in things like acts of identity making, forms of memorialization, rituals and icons, and drawn on research by Maria Malksu, Brent Steele, and Jelena Spotish. As well, Katarina Kimball and Jennifer Mitzen in 2020, I think this was an introduction to a special issue, this 2020 special issue that came out, suggested that anxiety precedes fear and leaves space for political possibilities that are not only characterized by fight or flight security responses driven by fear, but while fear produces this emotional reflex, anxiety sort of had this intervening point where you can ask, how can I stop feeling fearful, which is a more reflective response and therefore open to political possibilities. But of course, an anxious society is very responsive to a politics of fear, and anxiety upon anxiety escalates. And sort of we see these policies that might look much more like a fight or flight security response. So I think there's been a fair bit of research in ontological security studies that attends to this sort of societal anxiety in the context of trauma and crisis. And this is also in parallel with a shift to consider the political potential of ontological insecurity in the context of a normalized existential anxiety. So I sort of here, in the context of this research, problematize the political potential by returning to the idea of the homogenization of the population, which I think reveals that normalized existential anxiety and this underpinning ontological insecurity relies on violence against minoritized populations. So the constant practice of ontological security for society maintains an anxiety that justifies violence against groups that are discursively constituted as a threat to that affective security. And this sort of maintenance of anxiety that justifies violence works in tandem with this performative violence that we see in response to, or as a form of remaking exogenous ontological security. So the endogenous processes of ontological security map more closely to the Lacanian conceptualization of a constant existential anxiety. And the violence in the latter, the violence in this context, is one of exclusion, including exclusion from normalized forms of protection from violence that are provided to society by the state. So I juxtapose these two dimensions of ontological security seeking in the context of attending to the violence they produce in the continuous maintenance of ontological security in the first instance and the continuous seeking of ontological security in the second. So acts and narratives of ontological security are not a response to violence or an explanation for violence, but are in this way violent. Violence is perpetrated against challenges posed to the state, both challenges constituted exogenously and endogenously, and exemplified in forms of violence against migrants, and specifically for this study, in the context of the case study, specifically migrant women. So that's where I will move, if I can advance my slide, I can. I'll move to the concept of violence and state violence that I try to draw in this research. So I start with the World Health Organization, which has this sort of binary between interpersonal violence and collective violence. But in the context of a theory of the state as a system of power, I try to think of these things as more of a relationship, or maybe a nonlinear continuum, or a dynamical system where interpersonal violence interacts with collective violence and with the power of the state, and is or can be an outcome of those power structures. If we think of the state as fragmented or as a system composed of multiple agents, actors, institutions, and relationships, then a theorization of collective violence has to be more complex than a unitary actor harming a defined population. So to think this through, I turn to, in the UK, domestic homicide reviews. I was introduced to these by a colleague working on a current grant project, and I've been a little bit fascinated with them ever since. And so domestic homicide reviews exist as a procedure in a few different countries, but I'm going to talk specifically about the UK in this context. So, oh, I'm going the wrong way, there we go. So every time that there is a domestic homicide, the local authority in the UK, so this is the local governance structure, the local authority in which the homicide took place, does a review into the circumstances that led to the homicide, and traces in this review every interaction of the deceased with state services to examine points at which the homicide might have been prevented. So this review is a process in general that applies to all unexpected deaths. So, you know, to carry out a review of the various forms that an unexpected death might have been prevented is standard practice, but the domestic homicide review is an additional step. It's an additional mechanism that only is used in the context of domestic homicide or domestic violence fatalities. And what's really interesting to me about this process is that it represents how the state actively holds itself accountable. So the state considers if there was any point at which, and I'm using the term of the state loosely as well, I'm thinking of it as a fragmented system of power, considering if there was any point at which the death of a victim of domestic violence could or should have been prevented. So it's very fragmented in the sense that it involves multiple units and agencies, and these are carried out by local authorities. Again, so this is the sort of local governance structure. It's happened since 2013, but it's only been very, very recently that the Home Office has started to create a model for standardization that would allow the data on this to be analyzed as a whole. So they're quite sort of dispersed. And standard things to see on here are GP visits, so visits to like a family doctor, interactions with health visitors, if there are children involved. So the health visitor structure in the UK is the main point where sort of health and social care interacts with families with preschool aged children before they enter the school system. And then other health appointments like antenatal appointments, A&E or emergency room visits. Healthcare is a key place where people who are typically hard to reach interact with the state. Any previous interactions with police are recorded on these documents. So this highlights the importance of being able to report abusive behavior to the police. And then, you know, you might also see things like education institutions with regards to absences from school, or if schools have had any interaction with families. You might see employers, and also interviews with families and friends and acquaintances. But what I find really interesting is that the state identifies these key areas of healthcare and policing as the key points of interventions. Like these things crop up across domestic homicide reviews in general, despite the fact that they haven't been carried out in a very standardized way. These are always things that appear on them. But simultaneously, the state actively and purposefully restricts access to these very things for migrant women in insecure status. So I'll just give a little bit of information about how these restrictions work. So first, women who have no recourse to public funds in the UK often cannot seek support from specialist services, like specialist domestic violence services, unless those services are specifically designed for women with no recourse. So they're often underfunded and lack institutional economic security. So the no recourse to public funds is a visa stipulation that applies to anybody who's in sort of on a spousal visa status or as a spouse of a person who's employed in the UK or a temporary visa. So you have this kind of limited possibility of interaction with specialist domestic violence services. Then police report people who are suspected to be without secure migration status to the Home Office. So this came from a directive from the Chief of Police, and it filters through different police constabularies, so different local sort of policing jurisdictions. And this is the case even when people are victims of crimes. So victims and witnesses to crimes can be reported by police who attend that crime to the Home Office if the police suspect them to be in insecure status. And this reporting happens sometimes on quite a wide scale. But the impact of this, the effect of this, is that women are quite unlikely to report domestic violence if they're in insecure status or if their status relies on a relationship with the abuser. And then, so that's sort of policing. Then healthcare is quite interesting. So in the UK, we have the National Health Service. Between 2005 and 2018, it was quite standard practice that if a migrant was suspected to be undocumented, the NHS or healthcare services that person interacted with could report them to the Home Office. This was then suspended in 2018 after protests from medical staff that this was harmful, and when the British Medical Association sort of rejected it. And policy hasn't actually been changed, but the practice of reporting was paused while under review. But because migrants in insecure status can still be charged for secondary and tertiary healthcare, if they don't pay these charges, which are often very high, I think they're assessed at 150% of the cost of care, but I might be wrong on the particular percentage, but it's above 100% of the cost of care. So they're very high charges, and they're often very unexpected. But if they don't pay, they can then be referred to the Home Office for non-payment, and that non-payment can be used against them even in future immigration cases. So there's still this sort of paywalling of healthcare for people in insecure migration status. So my argument is that this collection of policies specifically harm migrant women and put them or leave them in danger of violence, and that we can conceptualize this as a form of state violence. Of course, the direct interpersonal violence and abuse is not enacted by the state as the actor, but the state consciously refuses to protect migrant women with services that are considered instrumental by the state itself. And, you know, I'm using the term the state sort of loosely here. But it's considered instrumental in preventing domestic homicide. And so I think that's quite revealing. My argument sits at this intersection of gender-based violence and violence against women, which is well recognized as a problem at the state level. It's been identified as a problem within policing and other systems and institutions. So that's sort of the one case. And then border violence as well. It's another means of devaluing the lives of migrants. Most of the policies that lead to increased risk of violence are part of the collection of policies in the UK that are referred to as the hostile environment, but similar policies are replicated in other settings, sort of across Europe, in the US, Australia, and New Zealand, and a number of other places. So I think these policies can be looked at collectively as being actively designed to produce a hostile space. I mean, it's in the name and in the UK specifically. And so in this case, the state is weaponizing domestic violence as a deterrent against migrant women. This is relevant, I think, and I think I have one more slide actually that I have not moved to. This is relevant in the context of ontological security, because we see this sort of Mobius ribbon. I really like this analogy that was made by Didier Bigot. This is sort of referring back to maybe mid-2000s or early 2000s. This Mobius ribbon of the endogenous anxiety that's connected to the performative and exogenous acts of violence that reproduce and serve to legitimize the authority on the use of force and violence in order to protect sovereign borders. So the ontological security of the state as the sovereign unit in the world, combined with the ontological insecurity of an internal state identity that's always insecure, because just going back to what I said earlier, sort of relies sort of on this separation of minoritized populations. In this context, this creates a recipe for violence against migrant women, and migrant women collectively become a symbol for a non-normative identity that contests the normative state identity that's necessary for the process and the performance of ontological security. And I think I'll stop there. I'll just put up my, I think on my last slide, I have just contact information, but yeah, I thank you so much for listening. I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Innes, for this very much informative and full of amazing concepts presentation. Any question? Like someone can jump up and ask directly Professor Innes. If no question, I can start, and maybe then people can join. So, first of all, Professor Ernest, thanks again. Like this richness of concepts you use, like amazed me when they still amaze me when I read your articles. So, you use a lot of concepts: intersectionality, positionality, trauma, like definitely narrative, and reducing inequality as the state tries to or seeks to sustain its ontological security, right? However, like I have one, while you were presenting, one question jumped to my mind. You said you for the indigenous dimension of ontological security, you relied on Lacanianism, right? On Lacanian ontological security, right? And then the state weaponizes the state as a fragmented system of order. Let's say unconsciously, as I understood it, or as I would interpret what you said, unconsciously would weaponize and symbolize the minority, the body, and the subjectivity of women migrants, right? To be an object, an other that is non-me. That is not me, right? Mm-hmm. But this, like, how this can be Lacanian, like how this can be located with Lacanianism, because to the best of my understanding of Lacan and Lacanian ontological security, the subject or the self, according to Lacan, is always lacking ontological security, right? And it needs the other, and it cannot be justified or satisfied by the other. So it's paradoxical. The more you need to fulfill yourself, the more you need the other, right? The more you need the other, the more you lose yourself, right? So, but when you securitize, when you weaponize and objectify the minority woman migrant, then you fix that other, right? So then you don't allow that other to grow with you. You don't allow that other to make yourself lack yourself again, right? In every step you are trying to fulfill your subjectivity, because the other doesn't grow with you. So like I try to criticize you here in using Lacanianism. So how can it be located within Lacanianism? I mean, weaponizing the minority woman within ontological, Lacanian ontological security.
So, I mean, I will proceed my answer by saying I am by no means a Lacanian sort of expert, and there's a very good chance that yeah, you have completely disrupted my argument, but I'll do my best to respond. Hopefully it makes sense. So with the I think I'm drawn on the Lacanian approaches to ontological security, and sort of how they've conceptualized this, like, this anxiety. And I think there's been kind of two threads to it. There's been this debate in the literature, I think, as to whether for it to be ontological insecurity, does it have to be in response to a very sort of specific, try to think of the correct word. And so does it have to be a response to something that's a very specific sort of trauma, something that disrupts the existing identity? Or can we look at it as this kind of continuous existential anxiety? And to be honest, when I first started to engage with this literature, I found it really difficult. I found it really difficult to kind of understand how this sort of continuous existential anxiety could be conceptualized as a form of ontological security, because I thought of it much more, you know, coming from the kind of the divided self and laying, and this sort of idea that it needs to be a very much a disruption to a solidified self that sort of divides and creates the insecurity. So it was something that it took me a while to like process and grapple with, and I'm never 100% certain on how I've done it or how I've understood it. Like I'm always kind of in process of rethinking that. So this is kind of where I am at the moment. I think to think about it in the context of state identity, this constant process of anxiety is because there is no solidified state identity. It doesn't exist. It's always called into question. It may be a narrative that's constantly reproduced. It's a set of rituals or performances that have to be consistently remade to have any type of tangible self. And the area that I sort of enter to look at this is in the context of minoritized populations. And the particular minoritized population that I look at, which is just one that I'm drawn out of, you know, what could be many, is migrant women who are in insecure status. But I think the same sort of framework could be applied to other minoritized populations in other contexts, because it's this idea of sort of, in order to have a normative identity, you need to have, like you said, this sort of non-normative outside, so that we know where the boundaries are on the identity core. What I'm interested in is not to question whether or not this happens or to sort of conceptualize the process, but to look at where violence emerges and often is hidden as a result of this. And so that's kind of where I am at the moment. I think we have this sort of core normative identity of the state, national identity, and then there are non-normative identities, which are multiple. And, you know, we might look specifically at minoritized identities. I think that a previous paper that I published last year, I looked specifically at like violence against women, but, you know, looking at women much more generally than this very specific community of migrant women in insecure status, which is much more bounded in this context. But I'm interested in sort of where these processes sort of bring about violence, or, you know, how we can understand violence happening as a result of these processes, and also where violence gets hidden because of them. And I think, you know, in this particular case, that's one thing we see, because the state is constantly, you know, for the state to be ontologically secure, which I think as a unit it is, we generally, you know, in the world, we generally don't question the state as being the unit around which we organize politics, around which we organize international politics. It's generally sort of pragmatically accepted. So I think that's why I sort of have that different conceptualization of the exogenous ontological security, but internal to the state maybe, or within societies, we have this process which is ontological insecurity, and it's constant. And then violence, because state violence is legitimized as part of the ontologically secure state, that legitimate violence hides the violence that's happening within, you know, maybe internal to the state, or against minoritized populations, or against non-normative identities. So that's kind of where I am. I don't know if that responds to your question.
Oh, very much. This is so much great. And it is really creative, you know, like this hidden violence which is produced while you are legitimizing, you know, your security or reducing your security. I think this is super creative, and also it reminds me of Vivini Jabri in her book Discourses on Violence. Like, it talks to it in a way or another. So I think this is very creative. Like, I'm sure it would be great. Jason, may please.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thank you, Alexandra. That's really fascinating. I get a sense from you that there's a normative commitment behind this, that you are clearly against, or correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're against the exclusionary effects of ontological security-seeking practice, because it is exclusionary towards migrant women, and indeed is violent towards. Now, I've been thinking about what ontological security studies can say about that, that's not just explaining that. Can it? Because I think it does a very good job of explaining that, right? That it says that there are, I guess, populations within states that have this anxiety, and they address that anxiety, well, populists address that anxiety by raising a politics of fear that then excludes certain subjectivities, in this case, migrant women, and is violent towards them. So there's this, and you cited Kinville and Mitson, who talk about this anxiety-fear binary. And it seems like that the only way we can get ontological security that addresses anxiety is by embracing fear, or the only way we can address fear is by embracing anxiety. And I just find that normatively problematic within ontological security studies, because it's like saying, well, we can't have one without the other, and we end up with normative problems that are explained but not addressed. So I wonder if, as a result of this inquiry, which is really fascinating and really grounded, and it sounds very rigorous and will make a great contribution, but I wonder if out of that there is a normative question to ask, is can we, as OSS, ontological security studies, articulate identities that do not lead to these exclusionary acts of violence? Can we articulate a cosmopolitan identity that addresses both fear and anxiety? And how do we do that? Those of us that are interested in taking ontological security a bit further.
Oh, that's a big question.
Yeah.
That's a big question. I want to sort of really give it proper thought, and I'm going to try and give an answer, because that's what we do in these situations. But I'll probably go home tonight and rethink it and have a different answer, and then next week I'll have another answer again. So don't think that what I say now is my definitive response. So the first sort of step is, I think, that I would have to take to begin to answer this question, which I don't know if I can. You're just hearing my sort of stream of consciousness now, so I apologize for that. Then the first step I would take is is it the role of ontological security sort of as a research paradigm to do that? Because I think I agree with you, it's very good at sort of explaining what's going on, in terms of then sort of having a platform to address it, maybe, or a process to address it. I think this is maybe what has been kind of a few people have started to do with this idea of thinking we need to think about the political potential of ontological security. And my first response to that, and this is what when I said I sort of struggled with the anxiety and the Lacanian approach at first, when I first started engaging with this literature. My initial approach to this was to look at it in a sort of ontological security trauma context. And, you get to this point where ontological security has to be this divided, this problem of the divided self, this inability to act because of the insecurity. And I was sort of very much there for a while. And this project is the first project that's sort of taken me a little bit away from that, I think. And so but I keep sort of arriving at the problems as opposed to the political solutions. And so I agree that, you know, having some sort of normative response, like we can keep on identifying problems, but eventually that's going to just become sort of nihilistic. We just end up with like, well, the world is a problem, the state is a problem, states have the monopoly on violence, and that's a problem. We can't do anything about it, which is something I sort of get sad about every day. So yeah, I sort of share the motivation, but I'm not sure whether I'm not sure of what the steps to take are to kind of move ontological security studies. Like my question is this the best route, or does it need something else? And what is the additive that we need to be able to get to sort of identifying that political potential? But I think there are sort of a number of people who are interested in this question and are working on it, and I'm just not sort of familiar with, or maybe possibly even up to date enough at the moment to be able to kind of say exactly what they are. But I think, yeah, I share your question, and I have no answer. That's kind of
just, if I could just briefly come back. I mean, I think exposing the way ontological security seeking practices work is normatively important, right? Because it, like you say, it does demonstrate power at work through narratives, myths, and so on, and exposes the consequences of that. So I think that then is normatively important. So I think it's still an important contribution that the explanatory version of ontological security studies is doing. It's normatively important to keep doing that. But it does lead to the kind of waking up every day, oh, we're exposing all this, but how do we change it? You know, it's that classic question of, is the role of theory to explain or change the world, which is the critical security studies question, I suppose. Yeah, but thank you.
No, you know what, I saw really recently at an ontological security workshop I attended back in February, I saw some research presented that was sort of operationalizing the concept specifically, and this isn't sort of normative theory, but it was very practical with regard to environmental policies for like ocean cleanliness, the ocean environment, and it was super interesting. I'm going to look it up and send it, just in case you're interested. I can look it up and send it to you, because I was really sort of on board with this, and it was super interesting, but it was really sort of going in a different direction from what I'd seen. But it was more sort of like practical than normative. But yeah.
Thank you.
Any other question? Irma, please.
Thank you, Professor Innes. That was just really fascinating work you're doing, as always, because we have been also, you know, benefiting from your work, as we did this night as well. So I was just curious. I mean, I'm not really sure whether it's really relevant, but just thinking about the bulk of research on like how COVID like altered migration politics, everyday politics, and like how ontological security is formulated. I'm just curious to see, maybe do we have some knowledge, maybe some evidence on how COVID altered the healthcare practices and therefore maybe domestic, you know, politics within UK maybe, or other countries as well. I was just curious to see whether we have something solid going on as like further research. Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, I've seen a couple of articles. I'm sorry, I'm really bad at like remembering kind of names and sort of references to give people, so I really apologize for that. I have seen like bits and pieces here and there sort of looking at COVID. I think it kind of speaks to, you know, a lot of ontological security literature look specifically at trauma and that sort of thing. I think one of the things that was maybe quite interesting in this context was COVID sort of required like a security response to a health issue in a lot of ways, which I know can be sort of, you know, conceptualized as quite a negative thing and quite a restrictive thing. But what I was really interested in was how it had to push how I don't know if it's the concept of the public or just the discourse of the public and who the public are. It sort of had to push inclusion in that context, because, you know, it was something where it was very clearly benefit, for example, to vaccinate everybody. Like, you couldn't say this person has the right to have this vaccination and this person doesn't, because if you started excluding along those lines, you would have very ineffective vaccinations and etc. And different countries handled it in different ways, but I think in the UK context, this sort of narrative of the health public was quite inclusive. I mean, obviously there were sort of, you know, problems to that as well. You know, it wasn't perfect, but it was inclusive in the sense that there was a real sort of push to get people to get vaccinated who would not conventionally have access to healthcare systems, or would not maybe be interacting with healthcare systems. And this was, you know, quite visible, I think, in different contexts. The extent to which it was effective is another question in terms of what the data looks like. But I think that sort of difference, it's a very different sort of idea of the public and the public good from what we often see in, say, like narratives of securitization around immigration, which are sort of making the case that immigration restrictions are for the public good, which is questionable anyway, you know. But yeah, I think this sort of push in terms of how an inclusive public might look was quite interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Ahsan, please.
I'm really amazed by your work. Thank you for that presentation. So I'm gonna ask something similar to your work, but also I'm curious about like if you have seen any discriminatory works of the homicide offices against the different minority groups, because I've been also studying the migration policies of Denmark against Syrians and Ukrainians. So there are a bunch of examples across Europe. So I'm really curious about that topic, if there are any examples or if you have seen any of them. So maybe there are some.
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of talk anecdotally to that, mostly because, you know, these domestic homicide review documents are so they're not standardized. I think they're in process of being standardized at the moment, so they will sort of eventually create a standardized data set that you can kind of pull things out of specifically, but they're not standardized. They're quite sort of different according to how each different local authority organizes them. And so you can kind of pull these things out that like occur commonly across them, but in terms of like being able to look at them as a cohesive data set is quite difficult. And I worry as well that the standardization of them might lose some of the richness, because then you get into one document and there's just sort of pages and pages of, you know, different interviews and records and things that you can look at. And if the data is standardized, I suspect it'll become a bit more limited. But sorry, to speak directly to your question, within them, there's been certain things that have been noticed that it's really different. And, you know, I'm speaking from my colleague, one of my colleagues in particular, but colleagues who have looked at these in a lot of different contexts, because I've only really looked at sort of the practicalities of like what they do and what this means for state accountability and that sort of thing, but have looked more into the content. And you find things like generally ethnicity is only stated if the victim of the domestic homicide is an ethnic minority, and otherwise it'll just be left blank. So there's this sort of like core normative whiteness in them. And then there was quite recently published an analysis just of the concept of movement within them. So no one sort of pulled out where insecure migration status has kind of had an impact, but it crops up across them. But I think the best way that it's been sort of studied across the collection of documents at the moment has been just with relation to movement. But it's quite interesting that it hasn't been sort of included within them whether or not the person's in insecure migration status, specifically because this has a direct impact on how likely they are to interact with services. So I think this is another perhaps kind of indicator of bias there.
Any other question? Okay, then was so much amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Innes. And maybe we need another like webinar or maybe workshop on how you use all these amazing concepts and how you put them together. You know, it's like when I read your articles, I feel I am read. It has some poetic dimension in your writing. So we need another like maybe workshop or webinar on that specifically. So thank you so much for this amazing presentation, and thank you everyone for your questions and for your attendance. And
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a privilege, like the opportunity.
It was so great to have you. Thanks again.
Really loved it, and thank you as well for all the questions. Really great.
Thank you so much. And I think Irman will produce that on podcast that on YouTube, right?
Yes, both on Spotify and YouTube for just eternity, for others to benefit from.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
very much.
See you.
Bye.
Bye bye.